I'm Alexandra McMahon. I'm here today with Jordan Bond and Sarah Levy, where we will be talking about the instability in the Northern Triangle and the Horn of Africa. We will tell you the little-known reasons for fleeing those regions to help you understand those who are looking for safety and peace. We start with the Northern Triangle.
The Northern Triangle is the designation of three nations: El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. Cash flow is scarce, tax revenue is nearly non-existent, and 95% of crimes go unpunished. Controlled by gangs and drug rings, these high homicide rate areas of Central America are commonly the victim of turf wars, resulting in more deaths and more debt. Constant large-scale development projects displace the migrants of these countries, dispersing them further and further than they truly wish. Engulfed in drug running, rape, blackmail, and disease, the Northern Triangle is a sect of the world that could be considered abandoned by God. Two gangs control the Northern Triangle in alliance with the military: the Maras and the 18th Street Gang, commonly referred to as MS-13 and 18 respectively. Two major gangs control the Northern Triangle, the government unable to stop a force much larger than their army: the Maras and the 18th Street Gang. According to InsightCrime.org, both are fierce enemies that started around the same time period of the El Salvador Civil War. Created by deserters and war veterans in Los Angeles around 1980, it became widespread across the United States and Central America. This led to the creation of the MS-13 National Gang Task Force, tracking down the rural activities of such a large sect of organized crime. And after a bus shooting in 2004 by Maras claiming to be a government protest, Honduras reinstated the death penalty. Their deplorable acts include racketeering, drug running, extortion, illegal firearm usage, sex trafficking, and even witness tampering. As the people of these nations cower in fear, hiding from potential murder of their own kin, many try escaping to the north only to be stopped by US-funded Mexican border control, an agreement supported by Trump. According to recent research run by the New York Times, and I quote, "In the most recent fiscal year, about 77,700 migrants caught on the southwestern American border were traveling in families. Nearly twice as many were detained in families of the previous year. About 91% of all of those migrants were from El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala, a region known as the Northern Triangle. Many are soon sent back, deported to their blasphemous and dangerous homeland, killed within months. And it isn't as if government intervention is an option." A quote from Law.org's Action Center: "Too often, government officials and security forces are part of the problem rather than the solution. In Honduras, some members of the military police, Tigres, army, and other security forces have been implicated in extrajudicial executions of young men, threats against and mistreatment of human rights defenders and journalists, and other serious abuses. In El Salvador, after violence escalated following the breakdown of the gang truce, the state's increasingly hardline response has been accompanied by reports of possible extrajudicial executions by police or soldiers of suspected gang members. In all three countries, local officials linked to organized crime contribute to violence and impunity. In a place where teens alone flee to the States, hungry and restless, and are sent back to live in a perpetual hell of bullet fire and disillusion. So much could be done to help, yet we do nothing."
Across the Earth, in a region known as the Horn of Africa, another little-known crisis leads a recorded 879,000 people to flee their homes. Somalia has been unstable since its founding in 1960. It was established from British and Italian Somaliland. After years of civil war in the 1980s, Somalia's central government collapsed in 1991. Since then, various Somali factions have fought to control territory. Only in 2012 did Somalia complete its political transition by electing a new speaker and federal parliament. They adopted a provisional constitution, elected President Hassan Sheikh Mohamud, and their new government was formally recognized by the United States in 2013. This past year, Somalia was supposed to have held its first democratic election in almost 50 years. However, their parliament votes on the president, not ordinary Somali citizens, and as a result, most of those members of parliament were elected by clan elders and leaders. This past election has been fueled by corruption, being considered one of the most fraudulent political events in Somalia's history. The corruption in Somalia's politics is not the only problem Somalia has been facing, though it did help pave the way. Somalia has a strong presence of the terrorist organization Al-Shabaab. Al-Shabaab, whose name means the youth in Arabic, is estimated to have between 7,000 and 9,000 fighters. They are allied with the terrorist organization Al-Qaeda and has imposed a strict version of Sharia law in the areas it controls. This law includes amputating the hands of thieves and stoning women accused of adultery to death. Al-Shabaab also has a presence in Kenya. It is targeting the country because it has sent troops into Somali territory to join the African Union force combating Al-Shabaab. Somalia's lack of an effective national government has given way for much of the country to become a war zone. Al-Shabaab was able to gain control of most of southern Somalia and some of the capital, Mogadishu, in early 2009. They only retreated from Mogadishu in August of 2011. Like many terrorist organizations, Al-Shabaab gained support by promising security to people in Somalia. However, people began to realize their true intentions when they rejected Western food aid during a 2011 drought and famine. Somalia is also facing a natural crisis, which, with its government in its current state, does not see a remedy in the near future. Somalia is in an intensifying drought, which has left it on the verge of famine. In the span of 2 days, about 110 people in just one region died of hunger. It is estimated that half the country has felt the impact of drought. The lack of clean water has increased the risk of waterborne disease, and the malnourished population has left them increasingly susceptible to those diseases. This would not be the first time Somalia is facing famine. Around 258,000 people died from hunger between 2010 and 2012. With all that has faced Somalia from its inception to the present day, the desperate need to flee makes sense. 17 out of every 100 people are displaced. Hundreds of thousands of people left their homes, and thousands of people remain in the Dadaab refugee camp in Kenya. Some camps can become as large as cities, and some have been around for a quarter of a century. However, the refugee camps are only a slight improvement. While you are able to access some education in the camps, there is no opportunities for employment after. The camps aren't much safer either. It is very easy to be killed. The United States has long been considered a global leader of resettling refugees. Surprisingly, more Somali refugees live in Minnesota than in any other state.
For 25 years, Sudan had been in a state of civil war, but in July of 2011, South Sudan gained their independence. Since 1956, Sudan had been in a state of conflict since it gained its independence from colonialism. Conflict in Sudan was mostly between Arab Muslims in the north and mostly black Christians in the south. The two sides are also separated by natural resources. Sudan is an oil-rich country, but 80% of the oil lies in southern Sudan. But most of the profits from the oil goes to the north to fund the central government in Khartoum. In 2005, the two sides agreed that in January of 2011, South Sudan had a right to self-determination and would have an independence referendum. Results were that 98.83% of southern Sudanese voters wanted to secede. Critics warn that secession could reignite conflict between northern and southern Sudan over oil resources and deep-seated religious and ethnic differences. The Sudan People's Liberation Movement, the ruling political party that originally led the way to independence, is now divided and fighting for power. Even before the crisis, more than half of the country's citizens lived in absolute poverty, were dependent on subsistence, agriculture, and suffered from malnourishment. What makes the conflict in South Sudan especially devastating, though, is that it's a combination of political conflict, economic hardship, and drought. Due to massive shortages, the United Nations has declared the famine in South Sudan as the worst in the world. Over 5 million people are at risk of starvation. 1 million, additionally, are at the very brink of famine. There are currently grave concerns for over 30 million people currently facing man-made food insecurity in the region, including South Sudan. There have been 3 years of poor agricultural condition. Many families fleeing the violence have fled into the bush with nothing but their children on their backs, where there are only wild plants to eat like grass, roots, and water lilies. But many would rather face starvation than the violence. Many families who have fled have been forced to move many times to escape the spreading violence. And the country has very little formal infrastructure, roads, buses, buildings, and therefore it's hard to transport food and supplies to those in need. Many towns and villages become inaccessible during the rainy season due to closed airstrips, washed-out roads, or a lack of roads altogether, sometimes limiting any delivery of humanitarian aid to the isolated areas in need. There is also an extreme shortage in healthcare, with only one doctor for every 100,000 people. The omnipresent threat of violence has made it dangerous for aid groups to reach those in need. For example, in July 11th of 2016, after winning a battle against the opposition in Juba, South Sudanese soldiers went on a nearly 4-hour rampage in a largely foreign residential compound. They shot dead a journalist whilst forcing other foreigners to watch, and raped many foreign women. On April 29th of 2017, 6 aid workers were killed in an ambush. In 2016, female aid workers weren't given help by UN embassies as they were gang raped by 15 men. After being given the choice between being shot and having sex, South Sudan has the 3rd highest refugee crisis, just after Syria and Afghanistan. Since the conflict began, 1 in 3 people in South Sudan have been displaced. 3.6 million people have fled their homes. 2.1 million people are internally displaced, while an additional 1.5 million people have fled to neighboring countries in search of safety.
Most people love the country they come from. The language, food, history, and culture are familiar. Refugees do not leave their country by choice, but for the reasons we've looked at today. And when we decide how to help, we need to think about these reasons first, not last. Thank you for listening.